I kind of want to give you a visual of what we are working with when we are multiplying numbers. Here you can see I have 2 times 3. So I went ahead and set it up as 2 3 times, where we ended up taking 2 plus 2 plus 2, where we were moving on the number line 2 spaces, and we did that 3 times. Okay, and when we were finished, we ended at 6. Okay, that's working with whole numbers. Today you guys are going to be working with integers, which include those negative numbers. So here's an example of something that we might work with today. We may work with something like, instead of 2 times 3, maybe we're going to do -2 times 3. So if we were going to represent -2 times 3 on our number line, well, we're still going to start at 0, for those of you that need that visual. And we're going to drop backwards 2 places 3 times. So there would be 2 places. There's 1, there's 2, there's 3, and we end up at -6. This is just a visual representation of something that we'll be working with. Now, it's not really ideal for you to use a number line, considering we're going to be working with numbers that are much bigger than 2 times 3. So the rule that I'm going to go ahead and present to you would be something like this. When we multiply integers, we're going to count the negative signs. If there is an even number of negative signs, the answer is positive. If there's an odd number of negative signs, the answer will be negative. What I tend to do, just to help you remember, is if you were to look at 2 negative signs, you could take one of those negative signs and flip it, and you would end up with a plus sign if you were to put those 2 together. So that's kind of how I remember, is if there's an even number, you could create positive signs. If there was an odd number, you would have one leftover negative sign that would create everything to be a negative answer. So, looking at the samples that we have here, back in lesson, I think it was 2 or 3, I'm not quite sure, we worked with where we would have 2 negative signs right next to each other. So I've kind of already introduced this to you. Anytime we had 2 negative signs, we could take those 2, it's an even number, and we could turn one of them to make a positive 12. Okay. Here, sometimes we may end up with more than 2 negative signs. So like here, those 2 would make a plus sign, but then this last one right here would end up making our answer a -12. And notice, here was an even number of negatives, and in this situation, we had an odd number. So we can use that even odd rule to help us decide whether our answer is going to be positive or negative. So let's practice a few of these. Okay, so we're going to start out really basic, where we're just going to count our negative signs. So if we go through and we count our negative signs, 1, 2, 3, 4, there's 4 negative signs. So 4 is an even number. These 2 would make a plus sign. These 2 would make a plus sign. We end up with a positive 6. Okay, so the answer would be positive 6 there, simplified. So we're going to count our negatives, and then if it's an even number when we count it, it's a positive answer, and if it's an odd number, it's a negative answer. Here we have 1, 2 negative signs. So is that even or odd? That would be even, which would make our answer a positive 8. Okay, here's another situation. Sometimes, just depending on what you're working with, they will throw a plus sign in there. Don't let that confuse you. When you are working with this, you are only counting the negatives. So here we're going to only count the negatives. 1, 2, 3. So 3 is an odd number, which tells me that it's going to be a negative answer. So here we end up with -13. And make sure, just a note for you, these are all kind of multiplying by each other, multiplying. So the opposite of -13 and the opposite of the positive of the opposite of -13, really confusing. It's just easier to go through and count your negative signs. So this rule applies when you multiply or you divide integers. Why don't you try this one on your own? The answer you should have gotten was positive 14 because there are two negative signs. Remember, we're not going to count these. So you should have ended up with positive 14. All right, so let's go ahead and put this together with some multiplication. When we multiply integers, first thing, we're going to go ahead and multiply the digits as normal. So don't think of this as a whole new process. We're taking two things that we previously learned and put them together. So we're going to multiply the numbers as normal. Then we're going to count our negative signs. If there's an even number of negative signs, it's a positive answer. And if there's an odd number, it's a negative answer. So here, I'm going to go ahead and think 7 times 10, which would give me 70. To finish out my answer, I'm going to go through and count how many negative signs are present. Since we're multiplying, that's why we get to count. There's only one negative sign present, which would make our answer a negative 70. So negative 7 times 10 equals negative 70. Let's try one more together. Okay, here I use the same digits, so the multiplication part is going to be easy. So remember, we're going to multiply the digits by themselves first. 7 times 10 is 70, so I got the same digit as the last one. Now I'm going to count my negative signs. There's 1, 2. That's an even number of negatives. And since we're multiplying, that's why we get to count the negatives. So even means it's a positive 70. So here, negative 7 times negative 10 is positive 70. Okay, why don't you go ahead and try these two? If you need to, you can pause your video. I'll give you a couple seconds to go through and answer these. You should have gotten negative 63 for the first one and positive 63 for the second one.